Welcome to the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies. Here's our director, Jonathan Kaplan, sitting to my right. And we're here today to welcome Professor Misha Klein from the University of Oklahoma. First, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, who are the Department of Anthropology. Misha's an anthropologist, as well as a Brazilianist. So a little bit about Misha. She's an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Oklahoma. She also works there with the other Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies, departments of International Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, Latin American Studies. And she was the recipient of the Oklahoma Universal Human Rights Award and the OU Regents Award for Superior Teaching. She was awarded her PhD in anthropology, 2002, from Berkeley, and her primary research is in Brazil and addresses the relationship between ethnic and national identity with the multicultural and transnational Jewish population as her entry point. Her book, Kosher Feijoada and Other Paradoxes of Jewish Life in Sao Paulo, with the University of Press of Florida, is based on ethnographic fieldwork in Sao Paulo, drawing on over 6 years of living and working in Brazil, and is being translated right now into Portuguese for publication in Brazil. And the current research, which we'll be hearing about, she's working in collaboration with the historian Michel Gherman from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. It considers the changing concept of race in Brazil, circulation of transnational discourses on race, Israel, Zionism, anti-Semitism, and the shifting political landscape in Brazil, the rise of the evangelical right wing, reverberations among leftist activists, and the impact of all this on Jewish identity and political participation in Brazil. And they've been publishing co-authored papers based on this research in 2 languages. So that's what we'll be hearing about today. And finally, I'd like to mention that this talk is part of a series, the Gale Collaborative on Jewish Life in the Americas. So, Misha, I'm delighted to have you here.
Well, thank you, Naomi. I really appreciate this invitation to come and speak. And where's Emily? I want to thank Emily for her excellent planning. And thanks, of course, to the Schusterman Center for this invitation to come and speak to you all today. And, of course, I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day. I know this is a difficult time at the end of the semester, so I especially appreciate you taking the time out to come. And I also really look forward to your questions and comments. So, as you might have picked up from Naomi's introduction, there are a lot of different interlocking pieces to this particular project, and today's talk is going to pull on a few threads that are kind of entangled at the center of this ongoing collaborative research project that I'm doing with Michel Gherman from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And he's a historian, by the way, so this is both an international and an interdisciplinary collaboration, which has been tremendously fruitful for both of us. Often when I'm asked what the research is about, I find that it's hard to know where to start, which of these many themes to begin. We began with the decision to examine the changing concept of race in Brazil in light of the social and policy changes that were set in motion following the UN's 2001 World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerances that was held in Durban, South Africa. And so as we were getting started on that part of the project, we collided with the 2018 presidential campaign in which, curiously, Jews figured rather prominently. So once again, in light of recent events in Brazil, I decided to shift the emphasis of this talk after I gave you this title from anti-racism to political appropriations. The original title was Philosemitism Without Jews, Brazilian Anti-Racism and the Imaginary Jew, and I switch it to Political Uses of the Imaginary Jew. So it's a small change in the title from anti-racism to political uses, but I would be really happy to talk about any of these themes afterwards and on in the day if anyone cares to. So let's begin with the present. In the opening speech of the 37th Summit of the African Union on February 17th of this year, exactly 2 months ago, today, the president of Brazil, Luiz Inácio da Silva, known familiarly as Lula, compared the war in Gaza to the Holocaust, igniting a firestorm of criticism from Israel and its supporters, and resulted in his being declared a persona non grata and unwelcome in Brazil until he apologizes. 1 week later, on February 25th, at a previously planned mass rally in support of soon-to-be jailed ex-president Jair Bolsonaro, a crowd of widely divergent estimates of somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million supporters filled the Avenida Paulista in the city of São Paulo. Intermingled among the gold and green clad sea of supporters were blue and white Israeli flags. The national and international coverage of the rally frequently led with observations of these many Israeli flags carried and worn by Bolsonaro supporters, presuming that this tremendous show of support for Israel was a direct response to President Lula's comments from the week before. Israeli flags were on hand for purchase for 50 reais, equivalent to about $10 in the US, or equivalent to about a day's wages according to the national minimum salary. The Brazilian flags were on sale for slightly less at 40 reais. Interviewers asked Bolsonaro supporters in the crowd why they carried the Israeli flag, to which they responded, because we're Christian, like Israel. These apparently confused statements are in fact drawing on you're allowed to laugh, it's completely ridiculous. But in fact, they're drawing on this well-established discourse that has circulated widely in Brazil for over a decade. Though still the world's largest Catholic country, like much of Latin America, Brazil has seen a meteoric rise of evangelical Christianity, and with it changes in language, such as the use of the term Christian rather than Catholic, and shifts in the symbolism used to represent national values. There is much more at play that could not be evident to those who are only now seeing this incongruous mass display of apparent support for Israel. But the rally was not, in fact, about Israel, in spite of the Israeli flags being visible everywhere. Positioned atop a trio elétrico, or mobile sound stage, high above the crowd, Bolsonaro himself waved an Israeli flag while he and others addressed the crowd. Beside him, his wife, Michele, opened the event with a speech that was a blend of giving thanks, leading a prayer, and laying out a tale of persecution, underscoring a tale of Christian grievance. Tying this persecution to her husband's rise to power, she declared, "Ever since 2017, we have suffered. We suffer because we exalt the name of God in Brazil, because my husband was chosen," note the use of the word, "and declared that it was God above everything." The former First Lady, who was gaining prominence on the political scene, spoke from her position as a Christian woman for 15 minutes, during which she made it clear that the rally was about Brazil and about her husband as its rightful and righteous leader. Quote, "It pleased the Lord to put us in front of this nation. It pleased God to put us in the presidency of the Republic so that we could work and do real social justice in the lives of those who most need it. And today, the Brazilian people know the difference between a just government and one that is impious." We are here today on this important day to say we love Brazil, to say we are not here with a goal of power, but for the purpose of liberty, for the purpose of prosperity for Brazil, so that we can be used as instruments for blessing people, to deliver our children from death, to bring food to the needy, to protect our widows. No doubt there are others who are deconstructing her speech, and these and other typical right-wing emotional appeals to save the children and the widows and the needy and the vulnerable, except for the kind that they don't like. But my purpose here today is to illustrate and explain the uses of Israel and Jews in the current discourse of the political far right. So it behooves me to point out that rather than a speech condemning the current president for his criticism the week before of Israel's management of the war in Gaza, Michel Bolsonaro did not mention Israel or geopolitics at all. Her only oblique reference to the current government was to call it impious. The only time she mentioned Israel was in the final exalted moments of her prayer or speech, a statement which got more media attention than anything else she said. "I praise your name and thank you, Father. I ask that you keep watch over our lives and that your true shalom be within the walls of Israel." Yes, she said shalom. "We bless Israel. We bless Brazil. We bless Israel in the name of Jesus. Amen. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Glory to God."
Wow.
Yeah, wow. But this is far from an isolated incident. Indeed, there are several moments from the past decade of political upheaval in Brazil that make it clear that this particular use of Israel and Israeli symbols carries other meanings. Moving a little further back in time, we can take, for example, the Brazilian national election in 2022. Among the many discordant and dissociative moments of the election, one in particular stands out as needing explanation and can help illuminate what all of those people were doing with Israeli flags on the Avenida Paulista. Again, this moment involved the then First Lady of Brazil, Michel Bolsonaro, wife of then President Jair Bolsonaro, who was running for re-election to a second term. In photos taken on the day of the second round on October 30th, 2022, photos that circulated widely on social media on the day after the election, the First Lady was posed in front of the ballot box, smiling and making the peace sign with her fingers and wearing a blue T-shirt. Printed on the front of her shirt was an image of the Israeli flag. The shirt itself was baby blue, a lighter blue than the celestial blue on the Brazilian flag, and lighter than the Mediterranean blue on the Israeli flag. This isn't some random or casual comparison, given that what was at stake was no less than the significance of these two countries, their national symbols, and the relationship between them. This appearance of the Israeli flag in the explicit context of Brazilian national politics would be interesting enough on its own to merit a critical analysis. However, this moment was made even more curious by the fact that the image was not of the entire Israeli flag. Instead, the flag on her shirt was made up of fairly evenly spaced vertical stripes, not as though it had been torn by hand, but more like it had been put through a shredder. Upon examination of the image, my colleague and anthropologist of religion, Professor Cristina Vital of the Fluminense Federal University in Brazil, commented that it looked like a barcode. In a neoliberal transnational context within which anything can be subjected to the processes of commodification and transformed into merchandise, this particular product demands our attention and calls to question what exactly it is that is being marketed. A T-shirt with the image of a flag of another nation could be propaganda for that other nation. But what would the goal of such propaganda be? How are we to understand its meaning in the Brazilian context? I would like to suggest that the use of the Israeli flag in the Brazilian context, and specifically the way it has appeared in protests and rallies organized by the far right in Brazil over the last decade, is distinct from its more familiar use in both international contexts and Jewish contexts, in which the Israeli flag has represented a range of things, from allegiance to a country of origin and citizenship, or a symbol of religious faith, or used in protests and critique of that country. Obviously, in the present moment, the Israeli flag has acquired other meanings and uses depending on how people position themselves geopolitically. However, these uses do not explain the meaning of this gesture by the First Lady. This image of the First Lady of Brazil wearing this T-shirt signifies much more than a simple commodification of the symbol, and cannot be reduced to a celebration of the economic relationships with this other country. Among other things, what catches my attention is the choice of the then First Lady to exercise her rights as a citizen of Brazil while wearing a T-shirt that suggests support for another country. This is not a new use of the Israeli flag. Indeed, it is now part of a recognizable and expected repertoire of symbols for what we must now recognize as a new political identity. To understand the meaning of the T-shirt worn by Michel Bolsonaro, which is really serving here as an entry point into a morass of symbolic appropriations, expropriations, and resignifications, we have to turn now to the public and political uses of this and other Jewish and Israeli symbols over the past decade of political turmoil in Brazil. Ever since the mass demonstrations in 2013 that led up to the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff and initiated a right-wing takeover of the Brazilian government, the Israeli flag has been used by elements of the Brazilian far right in political contexts, along with other symbols of the Jewish state and Judaism. In our research, among other things, we've been examining these uses in order to understand this nationalist discourse that draws on the symbols of another nation. The appearance of these symbols in political contexts accompanies the rise of the evangelical wing of the new Brazilian right. However, we do not see these uses as constituting religious communication, let alone expressions of Philosemitism. And so I don't leave anyone behind. For those unfamiliar with this term, since it's not a common prefix in English, the prefix philo means love for, which in this case would suggest that Philosemitism is the opposite of anti-Semitism. It's my hope today that you'll come to understand that these and other uses of Jewish and Israeli symbols are very far from expressions of love and appreciation for Jews and Israel. Before I get too much further, I need to explain that the formal Jewish community in Brazil has tended to interpret these uses of as being expressions of support for Israel. For the formal Jewish community in Brazil, this support is welcome, especially after their distrust after the first Lula administration's support for Palestinian self-determination. As such, many Brazilian Jews believe that displaying the Israeli flag signifies support for Israel, and therefore they throw their support behind the right wing, including Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro encourages this interpretation with visits to Israel, pictured at the Wailing Wall, photographed while being baptized in the Jordan River, and offering his unwavering support for right-wing Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, including before he reclaimed the office of the Prime Minister. And I should note that this discourse and the political appropriations of Jewish and Israeli symbols are not limited to the Brazilian context. During the violent insurrection on January 6th in 2021 in the U.S. Capitol, there were Israeli flags, connecting the relentless support for Trump to the uncritical support of Israel. I can hardly imagine a more extreme appropriation than the usage of the shofar, an instrument made from a ram's horn and used in the most solemn moments of Jewish religious observance, which was used by some during the insurrection. And while some shofars were seen in the crowd were painted with the stars and stripes of the U.S. flag, in one video it was being blown through the broken window of the breached Capitol building. Rather than a call to the Jewish people for a spiritual awakening, there was nothing religious in the gesture, or at least not any sort of spirituality that I recognize. Returning now to Brazil, it's important to consider these examples of the deployment of Israeli and Jewish symbols alongside other uses, such as by the sons of Jair Bolsonaro, in this case, wearing T-shirts with the emblems of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, and the Mossad, Israel's secret service. It should be noted that Bolsonaro's sons are also elected officials in Brazil, so it's worth pondering what it means when a politician of one country engages in political propaganda for another country. More so when this use of the other country is a means to promote a particular flavor of nationalist politics. In other words, there are many ways to show support for the values and efforts of another country, as we've seen, for example, in relation to Russia's war in Ukraine, when Ukrainian flags have appeared on everything from social media profiles to yard signs. This is rhetorical support. However, there's a sharp distinction between these expressions of support by the general population and the use of these symbols by elected politicians, and even more so when these acts are specifically connected to the exercise of their responsibilities as citizens or as responsibilities as statesmen. It's also worth highlighting that if these same acts of exhibiting foreign flags were carried out by Jews, whether citizens or politicians, the bearers would be accused of duplicity, often coded in the familiar accusations of being cosmopolitan or internationalists, that is, of lacking patriotism or even being traitors. Accusations like these have a long transnational history that underlie current moments of violent anti-Semitism. In the hands and on the chests of non-Jewish Brazilian politicians, these same symbols signify patriotism and belonging. From a semiotic perspective, symbols don't have stable, let alone universal meanings. Their significations depend on context, including that of the prevailing discourses circulating in the environs in which they are disseminated. Contemplating the appearance of Israeli flags in multiple political settings, from the infamous demonstrations of 2013 to behind the then candidate Jair Bolsonaro in his infamous speech at the Hebraica Club, a Jewish sport and social club in Rio de Janeiro in 2017, as well as in every rally in support of his candidacy to his inauguration in 2018, it is clear that waving the Israeli flag denotes something well beyond a simple support for the state of Israel. Through processes of localization, which involve the intersection of politics with religion in a particular moment in this country's history, hoisting the Israeli flag during the electoral campaign signified support for Bolsonaro and his fascist and intolerant agenda. Even more curious, the Israeli flag foregrounds a symbol, the Star of David, which 20 years prior in Brazil was practically unknown as a Jewish symbol. To illustrate, when I first arrived in Brazil at the end of 1992 and went straight into the what's called the interior, to a small inland city, I saw people wearing Stars of David, sometimes with a cross around their neck on the same chain. I was surprised to find that most people didn't know that the six-pointed star was a Jewish symbol. They thought it was simply a pretty star, and so I learned not to read too much into this use of the six-pointed star beyond it being a decorative element, especially outside of specific urban contexts in the city of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, where the majority of Brazilian Jews live. It was not much later that certain evangelical churches began to more ostentatiously incorporate Jewish symbols and practices into their services. The convergence of evangelical Christianity with Judaism in some churches who promote themselves as offering a kind of roots Christianity appears in everything from the use of Jewish religious garments by non-Jews, such as Edir Macedo's rabbinic self-presentation here. Brace yourselves, to the construction of the Temple of Solomon, colloquially known as the Third Temple in the city of São Paulo.
Wow.
Yeah, wow.
It's a little bigger than the Temple of Solomon.
What's that?
It's a little bigger than the Temple of Solomon.
I should tell you that the insight that I had for this idea of Philosemitism without Jews actually came to me while I was forcing myself to watch the two-part propagandistic biopic, Nothing to Lose, about the life and suffering of, he calls himself Bishop Edir Macedo. At one moment in the narrative, in one of his many persecution crises, as he tries to understand why he is yet again the target of investigations, Macedo resolves to travel to the Holy Land for inspiration, to walk in the patriarch's footsteps. Throughout this sequence in Israel, that is modern Israel, not ancient Israel, because he didn't time travel, there's no mention of Jews in this film, nor did any appear in any of the scenes. So this fetishism for the literal dirt and rocks of the Holy Land culminated years later in his exporting stones from Israel to build the Third Temple on Brazilian soil. But it was really only with the mass rallies in 2013 that the Israeli flag began to make a public appearance outside of Jewish and evangelical contexts. In other words, this symbol has taken on a highly specific meaning in contemporary Brazil, one that is quite distinct from those meanings presumed by those who were previously familiar with it before its appropriation in the course of the rise of the new right in Brazil. A corollary to this point is that wearing or carrying these Israeli and Jewish symbols does not necessarily imply support for Jews or interest in courting votes of this community, which represents a numerically tiny portion of the Brazilian population. Indeed, there's interest in Jewish things in Brazil well beyond the proportion of Jews in the population, which is around 120,000 in a country of about 215 million. The zenith of these appropriations and fascinations with Jewish things was the appearance and bombastic speech that I mentioned earlier by then candidate and now ex-president Jair Bolsonaro at the Hebraica Club in Rio in April of 2017. Michel Gherman and I have spoken and written elsewhere about the speech, how it was offensive in innumerable ways, such that Bolsonaro practically made a caricature of himself, how the mostly Jewish audience laughed and cheered him on the repercussions for Bolsonaro and the Jewish community, on the protests of mostly Jews that were outside the club that have gotten very little attention. And this was the first protest against Bolsonaro after he declared his candidacy. And how the community has been split, the Jewish community has been split as a result. So I won't go into all of that now, but I'd be happy to talk about it if you have questions. The relevance of that speech to the topic at hand is that Bolsonaro made use of the support of the mostly Jewish audience to cleanse himself of accusations of being fascist, accusations which he has not managed to shake until today. For Bolsonaro, this was a useful relationship with Jews as socio-political targets rather than Jews per se. This interest in Jews does not indicate interest in their well-being, in their ideas, nor in their survival as a people. Jews are interesting for their symbolic value. How could he be fascist if Jews support him? As such, this fascination with Jewish and Israeli things represent a type of Philosemitism without Jews, that is, the gentler side of anti-Semitism. These examples give us a glimpse of the actual meaning of the deployments of such symbols. First, the Israel that's being referenced is ancient Israel, the Israel of King Solomon, the Israel of the Holy Land, where the patriarchs created what became Christianity. This Israel is also the land to which all of the Jews would need to return in anticipation of the second coming of the Messiah. In other words, this fascination with Israel has little to do with actual Jews, with all of their complications, nor does it have to do with Israel of today, a modern state that is even more complex, but rather it has to do with Christian religious interests. Second, there's another Israel that's being cited by politicians on the Brazilian right, which is precisely the modern state of Brazil, but not the Jewish state itself, and much less Israeli society, which is far too diverse and contradictory for their tastes and purposes. And I realize this is an especially sensitive topic right now, but I ask you not to get distracted by the horrors that are presently unfolded in Israel and Palestine, and focus for the moment on the meanings that Israel as an idea or a symbol, an imaginary, has for these far right-wing political actors in Brazil, for whom the state of Israel represents a militarized ethno-state, a barrier against the imagined barbarism of Muslims and Arabs all around it, and therefore a model for how to deal with those viewed as undesirable elements, both internal and external. It is no coincidence that the biggest security firms in São Paulo are Israeli, and that Israeli special forces provided security training to the Brazilian military police ahead of the 2016 Olympics in Rio. Third, this Israel is also imagined not as a multicultural and multiracial society, but as a white country. In contrast to the critiques of Israel as a white settler state, this imaginary is celebratory of whiteness, but similarly depends on a very limited understanding of Jews as European and white, and ignores yet another complex dimension of the plurality of Jewish peoples. This white Israel serves as inspiration for certain sectors of Brazilian society that have long sought to reformulate Brazil in order to cleanse it of its non-white citizens, or at least significantly diminish their cultural and political influences. There's a fourth element, which is also imagining Israel as capitalist, kind of uber capitalism. But bringing together these points, the Israel represented by these flags and other symbols is a manifestation of a right-wing evangelical imaginary that seeks a Brazil that is Christian, white, and militarized. In Brazil, the Israeli flag represents a new community, a new ethnicity, if you will, one that is organized around political ideology rather than ancestry. Embracing these imaginaries, it becomes possible to declare oneself Jewish without relinquishing Christianity. Such is the case of Bolsonaro's international advisor, Felipe Martins, who, when caught making an apparently white supremacist gesture in a Senate session, tried to relieve himself of accusations by declaring himself judeu porém cristão, Jewish but Christian. And let's not forget, as long as we're here in the United States, the infamous case of disgraced former U.S. former U.S. congressman with Brazilian origins, George Santos, or whatever his real name is, who, among other things, made his among his many stupefying lies, cynically declared himself to be Jewish, falsely identifying himself as Jewish according to halakhic laws without having any Jewish ancestry.
Jew-esque.
However unique he might be on the U.S. political stage, in this regard, George Santos is not alone, but can be understood within this larger set of discourses. My research partner, Michel Gherman, calls these Jewish non-Jews, flipping the more familiar category of non-Jewish Jews articulated by Isaac Deutscher. These Jewish non-Jews shoulder the responsibility for the category of Jew without accepting leftist or progressive Jews into this new community. Leftist Jews are divested of their Jewish identity because in the thinking of this new community, the definition of Jew, that is the imaginary Jew, does not permit criticism of the state of Israel, nor does it tolerate the politics of inclusion in Brazil. This last point deserves more attention. When I say imaginary, I'm referring to the concept of the imaginary as it was developed by the social historian Benedict Anderson in his book on the formation of nationalism, imagined communities. For Anderson, the process of imagining is essential for the creation and maintenance of the nation, as an idea that is materialized by way of certain technologies that allow dispersed people to think of themselves as a community without knowing each other or even being likely to ever meet. In this sense, the imaginary is not something false or invented, but a vision, a projection, an understanding shared by a group, and unifies this group behind an array of symbols and practices that turn these dispersed people into a community in formation, such as the nation in Anderson's original formulation, or as an ethnic group, as seen among many other extensions of Anderson's concept. I wish to make clear that in questioning the declarations of Jewish non-Jews, I am not interested in policing the boundaries of Judaism nor of Jewishness. The phenomena I'm exploring have developed concomitantly, but have not necessarily been driven by the growth of conversions or interest in crypto-Jews and the reestablishment of Jewish identities by people who have discovered or come to believe that they have Jewish ancestry. Rather than evaluating the truth value of such claims, what captures my attention here is the appropriation of Judaism and Jewishness for other purposes without depending on the agreement or participation of those with Jewish ancestry who have other political orientations, as if political orientation were a quality that could dissolve ethnic identity. And yet we see evidence of this sort of thinking with seemingly greater frequency in political speech, including in the US. In this case, the community that is taking shape in Brazil is an ethno-political community that joins a certain version of evangelical Christianity with the far right. The Brazil that this community strives for, this Christian, white, and armed Brazil, is not a Brazil that is inclusive, multicultural, nor tolerant of difference. Within this framing, the apparent attraction for Jewish and Israeli things doesn't have anything to do with Jews per se, but with an imaginary Jew and an imaginary Israel deployed for other purposes. In the same way that anti-Semitism or other manifestations of hate of the other is based on stereotypes that have little to do with Jews or objects of hate, Philosemitism is also based on stereotypes, though these are supposedly positive while equally empty of actual Jews. So given this history and this larger context and this appropriation of Jewish symbols for other purposes, let's return to the image of then First Lady Michel Bolsonaro proudly wearing a T-shirt with the image of the Israeli flag shredded and transformed into a barcode, smiling for the cameras in front of the ballot box. Or, if you prefer, the image of her addressing the masses with a prayer for Israel in the name of Jesus. What could she possibly have meant by these acts, by this choice of self-presentation? In my view, on the one hand, she's expressing support for her husband, who has celebrated his relationship with Israel in the strict sense of his vision and use of the Middle Eastern country. She was also displaying a type of patriotism that fuses Brazilianness with evangelical Christianity to the exclusion of so many other religions in the country, and supporting a vision of a white Brazil to the exclusion of the equal participation of so many other ethno-racial groups. Considering the barcoded image of the Israeli flag, it could also be said that she was also proclaiming a utilitarian commitment with Israel as a product, a good, a commodity to be sold to the electorate, one that presents Brazil dressed up as a democracy, but a democracy for the few. In 2022, the Brazilian electorate opted for a less exclusionary country, as was celebrated in Lula's inauguration here. Nonetheless, the rhetoric connecting Brazil with Israel, a rhetoric with deep roots in the national political discourse, continues to thrive. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Misha, for your very illuminating exposition of these mind-boggling, to say the least, phenomena.
Your wows.
And I'd also like to say, looks like some brasileiros showed up, so be sure to help yourself to the food. Just because you're latecomers, you're still entitled to eat. Okay.
May I say something?
Well, of course.
Yes, this is the question and answer.
My name is Marcelo Paixão. Hello, Misha. How are
Tudo
you?
bem?
I received your invitation, your kind invitation. Unfortunately, my class will have an exam on Friday, and they took me, and I needed to. I'm in a hurry. It's my off hour.
Of course.
But I just wanted to salute, to say my welcome words on behalf of the Brazil Center, because I'm the director of the Brazil Center at UT, and so I make a point to say, I know that people here from this center is warmly receiving you, but I make a point to also say, be welcome, and my congratulations, your research is pretty original, wonderful. If I had time, I would be here all afternoon long, talk to you about what you addressed, but be welcome on behalf of the Brazil Center. Anyway.
Muito obrigada.
Obrigado.
Okay, I'll say something too. Tudo bom, Misha?
Tudo bem.
Welcome too. Sorry I was here late because I went to the other Jewish center, not on campus, but on the other side of Guadalupe. So, you know, my mistake. So I only I think I was here only for like 10 minutes of your talk, and I kept thinking of like previous appropriations of the Brazilian state of the Jewish community in Brazil, right? So, you know, when we talk about anti-Semitism in the 30s, right? So, I mean, how it was used for some like specific purposes, like economic crisis, right? And this use of a scapegoat, right? So I keep like wondering, why is that? What is this, you know, about like perceptions of the Jewish community, or maybe like some sort of invisibility, or, you know, how the state is invisibilizing because of this kind of a community that is there at, you know, the politicians' disposal to use for their conveniences. So have you thought of maybe like, you know, putting this in a bigger picture of, you know, our political history?
There is a much deeper history. And there's a deeper history that goes back to Dom Pedro II. I mean, there's the Emperor of Brazil, apparently, Marcel. The emperor, the early 19th century emperor of Brazil, was apparently fascinated with Hebrew, had his own Torah. I mean, so there's an attraction there, but it's an attraction that I think comes out of this idea of Judaism as roots Christianity, as being the basis for Christianity, for many. Certainly in the 30s, when Brazil so it's not, we can't understand it only in terms of religion. In the 30s, the integralists were interested in a different vision of Brazil, and this is also debates when they were explicitly working to whiten the nation and set up quotas, and were trying to decide if Jews were white enough, and so they show up in these conversations. And then slightly after that, when Brazil is flirting with joining the World War II on the side of the Axis nations, again the question of Jews figures into national politics, but it was really U.S. influence, I think, that had more to do with why Brazil entered on the side of the Allies. But there are just many, many examples throughout history of Jews, this imaginary Jew, being used well beyond their proportions. I mean, this is never about courting votes. I mean, nobody cares about, I think it's like 0.01% of the population. I'm not good at math, but it's absolutely insignificant in numeric terms. But symbolically, Jews are very interesting. If in the 20th century, Brazil wants to present itself to the world as a modern nation, which includes religious tolerance, then who's their foil? They turn to Jews, and so we just in each case it has very little to do with Jews, or next to nothing to do with Jews, but it has to do with these other agendas and what Jews can do symbolically for these kinds of arguments.
Is this on?
Just recording now.
Oh, okay. This talk was so fascinating, and I'm glad I'm going to get to talk to you later. But okay. So there was the moment that you showed, and I realized that I had like spaced out for a second.
I can go back.
Well, I'm in American Studies, so I was very interested in the shofar painted with the.
That was in the U.S.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So, so there were both neo-Nazi symbols and Jewish symbols there, and this kind of this tying of Israel to fascism, I think, is so problematic and so fascinating because of, particularly in light of, the world since October 7th and the way in which I saw this article, the cries of anti-Semitism as a kind of against anybody who's criticizing Israel, then becomes a way of making any actual anti-Semitism sort of invisible, because it becomes part of a kind of right-wing discourse, you know. So, and then there's also, I was looking on my phone. There's a Christian belief that, an evangelical Christian belief. Jenny Kelly is a U.S. scholar who writes about, and she's drawing on other people's work, but there's a Christian belief in like the importance of Israel because of the idea of the rapture, that, you know, Jews in Israel are just a prelude to, they'll all die because they're not really Christians, and then Jesus Christ, you know, can come. And so this kind of, as you suggest, this right-wing appropriation of Israel is not necessarily specific to Brazil only, although the way that Brazil is picking up on it, I think, is really fascinating, especially the idea that we can't be fascist if we're pro-Israel, because Israel itself is the current government is exhibiting behaviors that can be called fascist now. And so, you know, in ways that are, you know, we can debate it, and I'm sure there's all kinds of points of view now, but the just the nexus of things going on here, I just think are incredibly fascinating, and I am interested in, you know, how that relates to this actual Christian doctrine that holds an important place for Israel, which is why many Christian evangelicals in the U.S. have such strong support of Israel. It's not because they love Jews.
Right.
And then I also just wonder, this is related to your question, you know, what are the implications of this whole thing for actual Jewish Brazilians, even though it's a very small number? So sorry for such a long-winded question, which is mostly an expression of enthusiastic support for your work.
But this is what I mean by sometimes I don't know which threads to tug on,
right?
Because it's such a not. And yes, there are examples outside of the Brazilian context, but there's something else happening in the Brazilian context that makes it worth looking at. The need to get all Jews back to Israel, so that Christians can go to heaven, it definitely has very little to do with interest in the welfare of Jews. If you want a really good novel on that, and it's been ages since I read this, but my memory is that Michael Chabon's The Yiddish Policemen's Union is predicated on this story, and I've been thinking a lot about it. I need to go back and reread that because it's very playful. But the implications for the Jewish community are many. And I should say, so when I did my research for my book, before starting this collaborative project, outside of a few contexts, most Brazilians not only didn't recognize the Star of David as a Jewish symbol, they didn't really know what Jews were. They didn't, you know, even during this pre-World War II period when there were lots of anti-Semitic things being said. I talked to this one man who grew up in this small town as as part of the only Jewish family in this town. I said, "What was that like at that time?" And he said, "Oh, it didn't matter because people didn't make the connection between the things that they were saying and the Jew in front of them." Some of this was their teachings of the church until the 1970s that Jews killed Christ, but it was an abstraction, and so Jews kind of flew beneath the radar, and Jews really embraced the Brazilian idea of racial democracy, because it created space for them in this idea that there is no racial hierarchy, everyone is mixed culturally, if not racially, that was inclusive, and that Jews felt allowed for them to create the space. So there was no organized anti-Semitism in any kind of meaningful way in Brazil, unlike Argentina, which is a completely different story. And so Jews were very proud of this what we would call today an anti-racist discourse in Brazil. there was an anti-racist law on the books starting in 1950. You can go to jail for racism in Brazil. And anti-Semitism was added to that. So there's a lot of reasons for Jews to be proud and to talk about Jews in Brazil, I should also add, come from 60 different countries of origin. And there's Sephardim and Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, and they all participate in the same cultural institutions and call it the Brazil effect, this idea of everyone mixing and everyone getting along. And so they attribute even the way in which they're Jewish to the Brazilian context. And the shift in race that drew us into this project happened with this conference that happened in Durban, South Africa, that is virtually unknown in the U.S. for a variety of reasons, including the fact that it happened on basically a second before 9/11, so it just got erased. It was very controversial, and the United States and Israel and some other countries walked out. What that means is that they didn't sign the document at the end of this UN conference that, among other things, declared slavery as a crime against humanity. I have a whole other talk about. We can talk about what I think was really going on there, but in Brazil, which had Brazil and the United States had the two largest delegations to the conference. So, and in the U.S., it's unknown. In Brazil, it's a major topic. And the delegates went back to Brazil, and they created a secretariat, which became a ministry charged with dealing with race and racism. And they set up quotas in federal employment and set up quotas in higher education in the public federal university system. And that was the beginning of some tensions, especially between the Black community and the Jewish community. Partly because the Black community saw Jews as abandoning this discussion that was about dealing with racism, structural racism. And then some very well-known Jews signed a public letter opposing quotas, and only one of them has ever publicly taken it back. But so it created there's a whole other history of the relationship between Blacks and Jews in the United States. We're just starting to have this conversation now. I just had a panel 2 weeks ago about Blacks and Jews in Brazil. It's the first one that I know of where we're actually starting to really examine what's going on, because this relationship now is tense, and it's tense because of this letter. It's tense because of this walkout at Durban. And it's tense because Jews, along with a bunch of right-wingers, were opposed to any of these measures to try to redress racism because they were defending racial democracy, which was always aspirational and never descriptive.
Sorry, I have another.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll see you tonight. But the Jewish community ended up ripped apart after this Bolsonaro speech. And I can tell you more tonight, but it was that in itself is a whole other talk, but it's very complicated. Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much. And I'm going to run out right after in a second, too, because I also have to go to a class. But thank you for this amazing talk. I've done research in Papua New Guinea with a bunch of, I have very similar pictures of a very out-of-the-way tiny village in the middle of nowhere with a Papua New Guinean flag and the flag of Israel just above it.
Here, I have a picture just for you.
And so, and it's in some ways, a lot of that imagination comes from what the missionaries themselves were sort of imputing, and it's very much about an idea that people could become better Christians if they could equate their own culture with the ancient Jewish culture. And so that they would then follow the same trajectory that they were taught of, that Jews became Christians. And so again, it was a way of sort of securing that sense of so
an allegory,
a space for being a proper Christian in a way that doesn't seem to be kind of the same here. But it makes me. I wonder if one thing that's sort of cutting across a bunch of these different contexts is. Has to do, in a sense, with feeling like embattled or not quite secure in one's identity. So, in thinking about what the far right is doing, I mean, they're positioning themselves both here and in Brazil, it seems, as minorities, as embattled minorities who are
grievance politics.
Exactly, and that Israel then can be the figure of how you are an embattled minority in a hostile kind of context. So, I mean, they're both being ancient Jews, sort of equating themselves to ancient Jews, and at the same time to the modern contemporary state of Israel, both in seemingly in that sense of something about kind of trying to create a more secure sense of their identity in doing so. I don't know. It was really fascinating, and just sort of thinking about how flexible this image of the Jews is. That it's clearly getting exported all around the world to all sorts of Pentecostal
imaginaries are very fertile.
I wanted to ask. I don't know if you had more to respond to Courtney, but I wanted to go back to Durban and ask a little bit more, because I just want to know how influential Brazil and the Brazilian new president was in the whole construction of the discourse of genocide and Israeli genocide to the Palestinians.
How instrumental?
Yeah. I mean, didn't you say that the Brazilian president had,
Well, but that was 2 months ago.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
When he said that.
Okay.
So, and Durban was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But
the Durban, were Brazilians there?
Yes. It was the second, one of the two largest delegations.
Yeah.
But they're at Durban, in these UN conferences, there's always the formal conference with the official delegates and the official diplomats, which incidentally, in Brazil, there were very, very few, not even a handful, on the official Brazilian delegation of African descent, precisely because of the structural racism that kept them from getting into the diplomatic corps. Wow. And that's a completely different situation now because of these transformations. I mean, this was about finally addressing the structural problems, but there were things that were said at the NGO. There was lots of really ugly stuff that was said at the NGO conference. So generally, at these UN conferences, there's the official one, and then there's the NGO conference outside, which has all kinds of non-governmental organizations, and it doesn't go through the same kind of vetting process. And people had protests, and there were hideous images of Israelis and Jews, and lots of things that were said that would be better not said. And for some people in the formal Jewish community, Durban gets held up as the moment that contemporary anti-Semitism began, which is clearly not true. I mean, I can give you lots of examples where that is simply not the case. But rhetorically, there's a lot of stuff that was going on there. And that was part of why Israel and then the US and some other countries left with Israel. None of this stuff ended up in the final document. None of it was voted on. I think the only, don't quote me on this, but I think that the only thing that has anything to do with Israel or Palestine that's in the document is something about Palestinians having the right to self-determination. But Durban is like this dog whistle. I mean, the word Durban, I mean, I gave a talk once where someone just flipped out, never heard a word I said because I was talking about Durban, just lost it. And so and so in the United States, it's only this very small community. But what happened, I mean, there were people who came back from Durban, delegates who came back from Durban, who were on planes and looked out the window and saw the planes hitting the Twin Towers as they were landing. And they landed expecting a scrum of reporters, and of course there was no one there. And one of the participants said it was like somebody hit a giant delete button, because there was this major international conference. There had been controversial leading up to the conference. It was huge. Brazil had a completely different reality, and there was all this planning, all this preparation for the conference, And the conference happened, and it was tremendously successful in getting slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, declared a crime against humanity, which then it implies a responsibility on the part of the nations that signed that document to do something about it. Yeah. Sets the stage to finally start to do something about structural racism in Brazil, but opens up this can of worms. Yeah. In Brazil. I mean, it's made a tremendous difference. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary to see what the kinds of changes that have happened. But it's very significant in terms of Brazil.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. I wonder if you could expand a little more about the response of the Jewish Brazilian community to the appropriation of these symbols.
Yeah. So the Jewish community, not surprisingly, is not united in their opinion. There was certainly in the era of the dictatorship an unspoken agreement in the community that you don't criticize Israel, you don't criticize Brazil. If you're Jewish, you had a choice. You either were on the side of the dictatorship, or if you were against it, you kept quiet. And if you didn't keep quiet, you left the community. So there were Jewish activists and people who were disappeared by the regime who basically were no longer active in the community because they prioritized their leftist politics or their opposition to the dictatorship. So that didn't have the same kind of effect. When Bolsonaro spoke at the Hebraica Club in Rio, first he'd been invited to speak at the Hebraica Club in São Paulo, they have the same name and they are night and day. They're unrecognizably, they're not recognizable as being even remotely similar. The Hebraica Club in São Paulo is the size of a large city block. They call it a city called Hebraica. I mean, it's got everything inside of it, and multiple pools and all these buildings. It's a vast center, and it's a point of contact. So politicians go there to speak. There are film festivals. It's a major center. It's a major cultural center in São Paulo. The Hebraica Club in Rio is basically a little rundown place where hardly anything happens. And it's some kids go there for Israeli dancing and Krav Maga classes, and there's not much happening there. So first, Bolsonaro was invited to speak at the Hebraica Club in São Paulo. And there was a huge protest and a petition opposing it, and the invitation was withdrawn. So then the Hebraica Club in Rio invited him, the president invited him in the name of the community. And that really set people off. And so there was an organizing campaign with the hashtag Not in Our Name that was also the group that organized this protest in front of the Hebraica Club. But I was there at that protest, and it was really interesting to see people going into the club referencing the Holocaust and carrying Israeli flags, and people on the outside referencing the Holocaust and carrying the Israeli flag, and having completely different ideas of what those symbols meant. The day after this protest, there were about the same number of people inside and outside. The publicity was all for Bolsonaro's speech. The recordings have circulated, videos have circulated. All kinds of people have followed this and have heard him say astoundingly vile things, and even for him. And hearing this mostly Jewish audience laughing along with him. Bad for the Jews. It's just bad for the community. And in the day after, instead of chastising the president of the club for creating this situation, they chastised the protesters. They called it a pogrom. Wow. Which, if you think about what it means to strip somebody of their ethnicity, to equate Jews with the Tsar's army as that kind of a threat to the safety of the Jewish community is quite a move. And this was a formal statement from the official, the Federation. So, and that split has not healed. So there are Jews. I mean, I did an interview last summer with one of the people who were. I mean, they're interviewing left-wing Jews and right-wing Jews and talking to people about this. I'm interviewing one of the members of the formal Jewish community. And at one point, I was trying to say, when they use these Israeli flags, they're not on our side. And just try to say, wake up, because it doesn't mean what you think it means. But I think that there's this relief of being seen. And I think there's also interest in proximity to power. So the Jewish community, there are families that are split over this, but families are split over Bolsonaro who are not Jewish. I mean, this is it's kind of like the effect of QAnon in the United States. That big a rupture where you cannot have a conversation. So the answer, how has this affected the Jewish community? It's been energizing for some, but it's been very interesting to see this, like I said, this new political community emerge that appropriates all things Jewish, including Jewish identity, and excludes people who are ancestrally Jewish because of their politics.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And we don't want to exhaust Misha here.
If you want to stay, I'll talk with you.
I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you.
And this was a wonderful talk. And I do research in Brazil, and I am Jewish, and most of the sort of imaginary of Jews in Brazil that I have is the right wing. And so it was so important for me to hear you talk about this left-leaning left-leaning Jewish Brazilians. And I think this is not just Brazil, I feel like this is in the United States. And I guess, one of my other comments was just thinking about how, what you said about proximity to power. That there's, Jewish that are fighting against this rhetoric, but then I see, there
are some who are nostalgic for the military dictatorship.
Let's go closer to power. Let's go closer to whiteness. Let's go closer to so, it's really cool. I'm really thankful that you brought these distinctions and complexities. So thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much.